My stepfather used my college fund to buy his son a truck. He did it quietly over 18 months in small enough amounts that my mother never noticed, or maybe she chose not to. When I found out, I was 22 years old, sitting across from a financial aid counselor who was very gently explaining that the account my parents had promised me since I was 7 years old was completely empty. She slid a printout across the desk like she was delivering a diagnosis, and I remember thinking, I already know what this disease is called. It's called Gary. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I tell you what happened the night I watched everything he built come apart in front of the people he'd spent a decade trying to impress, tell me this. Where are you watching from right now? Because what I'm about to describe traveled all the way from a small Texas town to a moment I will remember for the rest of my life. And I want you here for all of it. I grew up in Harlingen, Texas, a flat, sun-baked city near the southern tip of the state where everyone knew everyone and reputations lasted longer than marriages. My mother, Carol Reeves, was smart, warm, and I say this with love, deeply afraid of being alone. My father died when I was 4. A construction accident on a job site outside Corpus Christi. I don't remember his face without looking at a photograph, but I remember the way my mother stopped singing in the kitchen after the phone call came. She didn't sing again for almost 3 years. When I was 7, she met Gary Hollis at a church potluck. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a voice that carried across parking lots and a smile he turned on like a faucet. He coached youth baseball on weekends, volunteered for the church auction committee, and had a way of making every adult in the room feel like they were the most interesting person he'd ever met. My mother laughed on the phone with him for 2 hours the night after they met. I heard her from my bedroom, and Gary had a son, Trevor. He was 3 years older than me. 10 when we met, lanky and quiet in a way that made adults say he was mature for his age, but that I recognized even then as something lonelier. Trevor's mother had left when he was 5. That detail got shared at family dinners the way people share cautionary tales, with lowered voices and sad headshakes, and it worked. Everyone felt sorry for Trevor. Everyone made room for Trevor. And when Gary and my mother got married the summer I turned 9, Trevor became the son Gary had always wanted to give a better life to. I became the other one. Not openly. Gary was never the kind of man who yelled or slammed doors. He didn't need to be. He had a more efficient tool. He simply treated Trevor's needs as urgent and mine as optional. When Trevor wanted to play travel baseball, Gary researched leagues, bought equipment, drove 2 hours to games on Saturdays. When I wanted to join the school art program, Gary said it was a nice hobby, and forgot to return the permission slip. When Trevor struggled in math, Gary hired a tutor within a week. When I failed a science test the following year, he told my mother I needed to learn discipline. My mother, to her credit, noticed some of this. She would push back sometimes in the gentle, hesitant way she had, asking Gary if I could be included in things, suggesting that I had needs too. Gary was always reasonable in those moments. He'd nod seriously, say she was right, and then simply not change anything. He had a gift for making people feel heard without actually listening to a word they said. What he was building, I understand now, was a story. And in that story, Trevor was the protagonist. Smart, athletic, deserving Trevor, who had already lost so much. And I was the supporting character who should be grateful she had a roof over her head. The college fund started when I was 7, before Gary even arrived. My father's life insurance had left some money, and my grandmother on my dad's side, Nana Ruth, a fierce, tiny woman from San Antonio who wore red lipstick to church every Sunday, had added to it every Christmas and birthday without fail. By the time I was in middle school, it was substantial. My mother told me about it when I was 12, sitting at the kitchen table after homework, explaining in her careful way that my dad had wanted to make sure I had choices. "Whatever you want to do," she said, "that money will help you get there." I held on to that promise like a life jacket for the next 10 years. I was a good student. Not in the effortless way that some people are, but in the way that requires getting up an hour early, sitting in the front row, and rewriting notes by hand every night. I wanted to study architecture. I had wanted it since the 5th grade, when a teacher showed our class photographs of buildings designed by a woman named Zaha Hadid, and something in my chest cracked open like a window. I wanted to make things that looked like movement frozen in concrete. I wanted to design spaces that made people stop walking and just look. Gary said it was an ambitious field. He said it like a warning. I applied to 5 universities. I got into all 5. The one I chose was in Austin, a program with a strong design department, a city I had dreamed about, and a tuition that my college fund could cover for 2 years before I'd need loans. I deferred enrollment for 1 semester to save more money working at a local architecture firm as a file clerk and junior assistant. I was careful. I was responsible. I was doing everything right. Then I sat down with that financial aid counselor and learned that the account was empty. The withdrawals had started 2 years earlier, just after Trevor graduated high school. Small ones at first, 500 here, 1,000 there. Then they got larger. Pay. I drove home from that meeting on autopilot. I remember the highway stretching flat and white in front of me, the mesquite trees on either side, the radio playing something I couldn't hear over the sound of my own heartbeat. I walked into the house. Gary was in the living room watching a baseball game. My mother was in the kitchen. I stood in the doorway between the 2 rooms for a moment, looking at the back of his head, at the way he sat in his recliner like everything was exactly as it should be. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and told my mother what I had found. The next 3 hours were some of the worst of my life, not because anyone screamed, but because of the way my mother's face moved through every stage of disbelief and landed, finally, on a kind of devastated understanding that she had been trying not to see for years. Gary came into the kitchen. He was calm. He said the money had been borrowed, and he intended to pay it back. He said Trevor had needed help that came up unexpectedly. He said he had planned to tell me. He said a lot of things in that steady, reasonable voice, and I watched my mother almost let herself be talked back to the edge of believing him. I put the bank statements on the table. He went quiet. My mother asked him very softly if what she was reading was true. He said it was more complicated than it looked. She asked him again. He said he had done what he thought was best for his son. And in that sentence, the thing I had known my whole life was finally said out loud. His son. Not our family. His son. I did not cry. I had spent too many years as a teenager crying in my room while Gary sat downstairs watching baseball. I was done spending tears on him. What I did was take photographs of every page of those bank statements, email them to myself and to Nana Ruth in San Antonio, and call a student legal aid clinic at the university the next morning. I want to be honest about the year that followed because I think people sometimes expect these stories to move quickly. They don't. Justice, when it comes, is slow and exhausting and full of paperwork. My mother did not leave Gary immediately. That is the part that hurt in a way I had not prepared for. She loved him. Or she loved who she believed he was. And dismantling a marriage, especially for a woman who had already lost one husband, is not something that happens over one conversation at a kitchen table. What she did do was open a separate bank account the following week. And she stopped defending him when I was in the room. I deferred university for a full year. I moved in with Nana Ruth in San Antonio, who, when I showed up at her door with a single duffel bag and shaking hands, made me a cup of coffee, read through the bank statements herself without a word, and then said, "Baby, that man stole from your father's memory. We are going to handle this." Nana Ruth was 81 years old and had the organizational instincts of a 5-star general. Within 2 weeks, she had connected me with a real estate attorney she'd used decades earlier, who referred me to a family law specialist, who explained that while the civil recovery process would take time, the documentation was clear enough that Gary's legal exposure was significant. Misappropriation of a minor's inherited funds, in the state of Texas, is not a small matter. I also found a job. A real one this time, a junior drafting position at a mid-sized architecture firm in San Antonio, where a woman named Patricia Okafor ran the residential design division like a very calm hurricane. She hired me after a 20-minute interview, looked at my portfolio and said, "You have good instincts. Don't let anyone tell you that's a small thing." I worked 50-hour weeks. I took online courses at night. I saved every dollar I could and sent $100 home to my mother every month, because old habits of worry don't disappear overnight. The legal process moved in the background like weather building on the horizon. Gary hired an attorney. He offered to settle. The number he offered was an insult. We declined. He offered more. We declined again. My attorney, a measured woman named Sandra Chu who wore the same pearl earrings to every meeting and never raised her voice, told me that the longer he stalled, the worse it looked, and that judges in family court had seen this particular pattern before. 14 months after I sat down in that financial aid office, A judge ordered Gary to repay the full amount, all $44,000, plus interest plus my legal fees. I wish I could tell you that was the satisfying ending. It wasn't. It was an important step. But Gary Hollis had spent his whole adult life being the charming man at the church potluck, the respected coach, the devoted stepfather who had sacrificed so much for his family. The legal order was a document in a courthouse file. The people who had watched him play his role for 15 years didn't know a single thing about it. That part came later. 18 months after the judgment, Gary and my mother officially separated. She had been quietly gathering herself the whole time, going to therapy, talking to her pastor, rebuilding the parts of herself she'd set aside to keep the peace in a house that had never actually been peaceful. When she finally told him to leave, she called me first. She was calm on the phone, calmer than I expected. She said, "I should have done this sooner. I'm sorry it took me this long." I told her the truth. "I know it wasn't simple. I'm just glad you got there." Trevor, to his credit, called me once after the separation. The call was awkward and short, but he said he hadn't known where the money came from, and I believed him. Whatever failures Gary had, he had also successfully kept his son in the dark about the worst of them. Trevor was not my enemy. He was another person who had grown up in the shadow of a man who arranged everything to serve himself. I told Trevor I didn't blame him. I meant it. What I could not forgive, and what I did not try to, was Gary's silence. Not just about the money, but about the 15 years he had spent making me feel like a guest in my own family. The years of Trevor's needs being urgent and mine being optional. The way he had looked at me across that kitchen table and said, without any real remorse, that he had done what was best for his son. I didn't forgive it. But I also didn't think about him every day. I had too much to build. I started university in Austin the following fall. I was 24 years old, 2 years behind the classmates I had imagined being alongside. I did not have time to feel sorry about that. I had the legal settlement money restored to a new account in my name only, a scholarship I had applied for through the firm in San Antonio, and a recommendation letter from Patricia Okafor that made one of my professors stop me after class just to say she had never written one that good for a student she'd never taught. I threw myself into architecture the way I imagine some people throw themselves into religion, completely, with my whole body and most of my sleep schedule. The work was hard and I was good at it. Not immediately and not always, but in the way that matters, I kept getting better. My professors had high standards and I met them, then exceeded them. By my junior year, I had a part-time position with a firm that did affordable housing design, the kind of work that puts a good building where people actually need it, not where it will look impressive in a magazine. I loved it. I loved the specificity of it, the way each project had real people attached to it, people who would live inside what I helped create. And in the back of my mind, quietly, I was watching Gary's life. Not obsessively. Not in the way that would have worried my therapist, a patient man named Dr. Ellison, who had helped me untangle the particular damage of being a child who was systematically made to feel like an inconvenience. I watched the way you watch weather from a distance, not because you're hoping for a storm, but because you want to be ready when it comes. Gary had remarried. Her name was Sherry, and she had 2 grown daughters and a large house in a suburb north of San Antonio. He had inserted himself into her family's social world with the same efficiency he'd used on my mother. Church committees, neighborhood associations, the kind of volunteering that puts your face in front of the right people. He coached Trevor's son's little league team on weekends. He posted photographs on Facebook with captions like "grateful for this family" and "blessed beyond measure." The legal judgment against him was public record. But it was the kind of thing that required knowing where to look. So he had kept his story clean. And his new world, Sherry's daughters, her friends, her church group, knew Gary Hollis as a good man who had been through some family difficulty with an estranged stepdaughter who had made things hard. I know this because Sherry's older daughter, a woman named Lacey, was in a professional network I was part of through the San Antonio firm. We had chatted a few times about projects. She was warm and genuine, and one afternoon over coffee before a conference session, she mentioned her mother's husband had a stepdaughter in architecture too. I went very still. "Gary Hollis?" I asked. The expression on her face answered before she did. Lacey and I talked for 3 hours that afternoon. I showed her the court documents on my phone, not to hurt her, but because I was tired of Gary owning the version of events that made him the reasonable adult and me the difficult, estranged stepdaughter. I told her everything, the college fund, the withdrawals, the kitchen table, the year I spent rebuilding. I told her what Gary had said. His exact words about doing what was best for his son. Lacey listened with the focused, uncomfortable attention of someone who is revising a story they had been told for years. She asked questions. She looked at the documents twice. Then she said something I didn't expect. My mother is about to give him access to her investment accounts, she said. They've been talking about it for months. He has this whole plan mapped out. A cold, specific anger settled in my chest. How soon? I asked. She was going to finalize it at their anniversary dinner, she said. Next Saturday. They're having it at the Riverwalk. All of us, me, my sister Dana, their friends. Big celebration. I looked at her for a moment. I'm not going to pretend I don't have an interest in what you do with this, I said. But whatever you decide, Lacey, your mother deserves to know. She nodded slowly. She already knew that. She had just needed someone to tell her the truth first. What happened at that anniversary dinner, I heard about in stages, first from Lacey that night, then from my mother, who heard it through a mutual church acquaintance, and eventually years later from Sherry herself. The dinner was at a private room at a restaurant on the San Antonio Riverwalk. 12 people, candlelight, a cake with their names on it. Gary was at the head of the table, relaxed and charming, making the room feel warm the way he always did. They had already ordered dessert when Lacey asked her mother to step outside for a moment. She showed Sherry the court documents. And she showed her something else, the Facebook posts Gary had made in the years since the judgment, the photographs with his grandkids, the captions about family and gratitude, none of which mentioned the woman he had stolen from. Sherry came back into the room. She sat down. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she looked at Gary and said, quietly enough that most of the table couldn't hear, I need you to explain what a civil judgment for misappropriation of a minor's inheritance fund means, because I am looking at your name on one right now. The room went quiet the way rooms do when something has shifted beneath the surface. Gary's face did the thing I imagine it always did when cornered, a flash of calculation, then that practiced calm. He said it was an old misunderstanding with an estranged family member who had made things difficult. He said it was a painful chapter. He said they could talk about it at home. Sherry said, the dinner is over. She did not yell. She did not make a scene. She simply put her napkin on the table, thanked the guests for coming, and told Gary she would need space to review some things. Gary tried to say something else. Her older daughter Dana, who had been filled in by Lacey before dessert, said very clearly, Dad, Gary. She asked you to stop. He stopped. From what I was told, he sat in the car for 20 minutes while Sherry went back inside to explain to the friends that there was a family matter that had come up. By the time he started driving, she had already texted her attorney. The investment accounts were never consolidated. The marriage lasted for more months before Sherry filed. I found out about most of this in pieces. I was not there. I had not planned to be there. I had not orchestrated anything beyond telling the truth to Lacey, who had then decided what to do with it. That distinction matters to me, because I am not interested in pretending this story is about revenge if what it's really about is accountability. The truth existed before I said it out loud. It had always existed. I just made sure it reached the right room. What I felt, when Lacey called me that night to tell me what had happened, was not triumph. It was something quieter, a kind of relief that has a little bit of sadness in it, the way you feel when a window finally opens in a room that has been too hot for a long time. Gary would not have his hands on another woman's financial accounts. Sherry, who was kind and did not deserve what had nearly happened to her, had been given the chance to protect herself. That felt like enough. I graduated the following spring with my architecture degree. Nana Ruth flew in from San Antonio. My mother drove up from Harlingen wearing a blue dress she'd bought for the occasion. We took photographs in front of the engineering fountain on campus, and my mother held my arm so tightly you could see her fingers in the picture. I looked at her face in that photograph later, really looked at it, and saw something I had not seen clearly in a long time. Pride. Pure, uncomplicated pride. Not the kind you perform for a church audience or a Facebook post. The kind that makes a person's whole face soften. Your dad would have been at the front of every row, she said that afternoon over dinner. I didn't say anything for a moment. I just squeezed her hand. I work now at a firm in Austin that specializes in mixed-use community design. We build things that are meant to last, spaces where people can work and live and walk outside and feel like the city was made with them in mind, not just around them. It is hard work and I love every difficult inch of it. I own a small house. I bought it with a combination of my savings, a first-time buyer program, and the last of the restored inheritance fund. It is not large. It has a porch that faces west and catches the evening light in a way that makes the whole front of the house turn gold around 6 o'clock. I designed the renovation of the interior myself, opened up the kitchen, added a drafting nook with a north-facing window for clean light. The first time I sat on that porch with a cup of coffee and watched the sun go down over my street, I thought about the 7-year-old girl who had been promised a future and the 22-year-old who had found it empty. I thought about the year in San Antonio with Nana Ruth and the late nights of studying and the long quiet road of putting things back together. I thought about Gary, sitting in a car outside a Riverwalk restaurant while the life he'd carefully constructed shifted away from him, and I felt nothing dramatic. Just a clean, certain knowledge that the people who build their comfort on other people's silence eventually find themselves in rooms where someone has finally spoken. I thought about my mother too. About how she had taken too long to see what was in front of her, and how she had gotten there anyway. About how love for someone can coexist with clear-eyed recognition that they made choices that hurt you. She and I talk every Sunday now. She's taking a watercolor class on Saturday mornings, which she says is terrible and she is very bad at it, and she sounds happier than she has in years. Nana Ruth turned 84 last month. She still wears red lipstick to church. She told me at her birthday lunch that my father would have been insufferably proud of me, and she said it with such affection that I laughed until I cried a little, right there at the table. What I know now, having lived through the particular kind of harm that comes from being quietly minimized by someone who smiles at everyone around you, is this. You do not need to be loud to survive it. You need to be accurate. You need to document and wait and build yourself so solidly that when the moment comes, and it usually comes, you have something real to stand on. You are allowed to tell the truth. Even when someone has spent years framing you as the difficult one, the ungrateful one, the child who made everything harder. You are allowed to say, calmly and with documentation, here is what actually happened. You are allowed to protect the people who come after you, the next woman, the next family, the next person who might sit across a dinner table and be charmed before they understand what they're agreeing to. And you are allowed to build a life that does not require anyone who tried to diminish you. Not a performance of healing. Not a revenge fantasy. Just a real, solid, honest life, with a west-facing porch and good light and your grandmother's voice on the phone telling you that you made your father proud. That is the ending I chose. And I would choose it again without hesitation every single time. So tell me honestly, if you had been in my place, would you have said anything to Lacey? Or would you have kept the truth to yourself and let him keep his story clean?